picture yourself standing on a green slope. You're just above a fjord in the extreme south of Greenland. The wind is, it's howling over the ice. It's carrying this biting, absolute cold that just seeps right into your bones.
Oh, yeah, that damp, freezing cold.
Right, and through that wind, the only sound you hear is the faint, hollow creak of the elements battering an abandoned stone building. You're looking at the ruins of a church.
A massive stone church.
Exactly. The walls are made of these heavy stone blocks, perfectly fitted together, but it's roofless now. It is completely open to the vast, cold Arctic sky. And, if you pull your gaze away from that church and look closely at the surrounding landscape, you can start to make out the faint, ghostly outlines of an entire society.
It's eerie, really eerie.
You see the rectangular foundations of houses, the sunken remains of barns, the barely perceptible boundaries of pastures carved into the earth. Because for nearly 500 years, this was a thriving European society at the very edge of the habitable world. And then, sometime in the 1400s, they just vanished.
Yeah. I mean, it is arguably one of the most profoundly haunting places on the planet. What you're looking at in that fjord is the physical footprint of the Norse Greenlanders. These were the descendants of the Vikings. And they built a society that actively farmed a razor-thin margin of green, nestled right between crushing inland glaciers and the freezing iceberg-choked sea.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. And they didn't just survive there. For centuries, they lived out a complete medieval European existence. I mean, they built multiple stone churches. They traded actively with the courts of medieval Europe. They elected their own political assemblies. They baptized their children, and they buried their dead in that frozen, unforgiving ground.
But there was no final battle.
Yeah.
No recorded massacre. No dramatic chronicle where a scribe sat down, dipped a quill in ink, and wrote, "This is our final day."
Right. Nothing like that.
Just a creeping, suffocating silence. The ships from Europe just stopped coming. And when sailors finally did return to those fjords centuries later, they found absolutely no one. The farms had fallen silent. The churches stood empty. The entire population was just gone.
It is the absolute definition of a historical vanishing act. This wasn't a sudden cataclysm, An entire society sitting at the absolute farthest outward limit of the medieval Viking world just slowly dwindled, struggled, and disappeared.
Leaving practically nothing behind.
Right. No written explanation. They left behind only ruins, animal bones in their trash heaps, and one of the most chilling, heavily debated mysteries in human history.
So as we open this deep dive, that is exactly what we're going to explore. It was a very special epilogue to our entire series. The mission today is to unpack the most poignant mystery of the Viking saga, the silent disappearance of the Norse Greenlanders. We really need to understand what it actually felt like to live at the edge of the world.
And how that life was slowly strangled.
Yes, strangled by forces entirely outside of their control. And of course, what the dirt itself can tell us about their final, undocumented days.
And to truly grasp the tragedy of their ending, we have to kind of strip away the pop culture myth of the invincible Viking. We have to look closely at the impossible reality of what they were trying to achieve from the very day they arrived.
Right. And the beginning of the specific chapter starts with a figure we know really well, Erik the Red. Now, we are not going to rehash the entire founding saga today. If you want the deep details on Erik's exile from Iceland and Leif Eriksson's subsequent push further west into Vinland, we've covered all of those voyages extensively in episode 13.
Yeah, that's a whole other story.
But we do need to acknowledge Erik's, frankly, legendary salesmanship.
Yeah.
Because around the year 985, Erik the Red named it Greenland specifically to lure settlers from Iceland.
Which remains, one of the most audacious and deceptive pieces of real estate marketing in human history.
The ultimate scam.
Totally. He essentially slapped a lush, inviting label on an island that is 80% covered by a permanent ice sheet.
And the craziest part is the marketing worked. A fleet of ships followed him, and they established two main population centers, which they confusingly named the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, even though they were both located on the western coastal side of the island facing Canada.
Typical Viking directions.
Right. But here's the critical pivot. We are skipping over those glorious founding myths today because we need to focus on the mechanics of the society they actually built. And the society they built was precarious from the moment the first anchor dropped.
Precarious is putting it mildly. The fundamental vulnerability of the Greenland Norse was deeply rooted in their cultural identity. You see, they did not come to Greenland as adaptable Arctic survivalists. They came as European pastoral farmers.
Which is such a strange choice.
It is. When they arrived, they didn't look at the harsh environment and ask, how do we need to change to live here? Instead, they attempted to impose their existing way of life onto this alien landscape. They brought their cattle, their sheep, their goats across the ocean in the holds of their open ships. They fully intended to raise livestock in the exact same manner they had back in Scandinavia and Iceland.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to a modern listener, this sounds completely irrational. I mean, it is like trying to maintain a manicured suburban grass lawn and a Florida orange grove on the surface of the moon. Why on earth would you force a European farming model, which intrinsically relies on long-growing seasons, rich soil, abundant pasture? Why force that into the Arctic?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of medieval sociology, culture is an incredibly stubborn, powerful force. Your identity, how you define civilized life, how you measure wealth, how you establish your status in the community, it doesn't just evaporate because you've crossed an ocean.
Right, you bring your baggage with you.
Exactly. For the Norse, wealth was fundamentally measured in cattle. A powerful chieftain was, by definition, a man with a large herd of cows and a grand feasting hall. To be a respected European Christian in the Middle Ages meant eating beef, drinking milk, making cheese, and wearing fine woven wool.
So it's tied to their whole sense of self.
Oh, completely. To abandon those practices and start dressing in sealskins and eating whale blubber would mean fundamentally abandoning who they thought they were. It would mean viewing themselves as savages, which their worldview simply wouldn't permit.
But wait, surely starvation beats cultural pride, right? I mean, are you telling me they would willingly watch their herds freeze rather than adapt their methods?
It wasn't about choosing to freeze. It was about forcing the environment to bend to their will. And during the early centuries of the settlement, the climate actually permitted it. Barely, but it did. They settled Greenland during a climatic anomaly we now call the medieval warm period.
Oh, right. So it was actually a bit greener then.
A bit, yes. Average temperatures in the North Atlantic were unusually high. The summers in those deep, sheltered inner fjords were just warm enough and just long enough to grow a specific type of hardy grass.
But even during a warm period in Greenland, the margin for error must have been virtually non-existent.
It was razor thin. To understand their vulnerability, you really have to understand the mechanics of Arctic farming. The summers were short, but the winters were brutally long, dark, and freezing.
Right.
They could not leave their cattle outside. To survive the winter, the Norse had to keep their cows indoors in heavy stone byres entirely in the dark for up to 9 months of the year.
9 months, wow.
Yeah. This meant the entire focus of the short summer wasn't just grazing. It was frantically cutting and drying enough hay to feed those cows through the long winter.
It's essentially a massive high-stakes math equation every single summer.
Precisely. If the summer was a bit too cool or a bit too wet, the grass wouldn't grow tall enough. If the grass was short, the hay harvest fell short. If there wasn't enough hay stored in the barns, the animals locked in the stone byres would literally starve in the dark before spring arrived.
That sounds like a nightmare.
There are actually historical accounts from Iceland and Greenland describing the cows being so weak from near starvation by the time spring finally arrived that the farmers physically had to carry the animals out of the barns to the newly green pastures.
Oh my God, they had to carry the cows.
Yes, because if the animals died, the people starved.
So a single bad summer could tip the entire society into famine. And we have to remember the scale here. At their absolute peak, we are talking about a few thousand people scattered across isolated farmsteads. So how did a society that small, living on such a marginal agricultural base, maintain a functioning medieval society? I mean, how did they build stone churches or get iron tools when they were living on rocks and ice?
Well, what's fascinating here is that they absolutely could not survive on farming alone. Their society was entirely dependent on a tenuous trade lifeline with Europe. Greenland severely lacked two critical, non-negotiable resources for a medieval society: timber and workable iron.
Because there are no trees.
Right. There were no forests in Greenland with trees large enough to build ocean-going ships or massive roof trusses. And while there was some low-grade bog iron, extracting and forging it required massive amounts of charcoal.
Which requires timber.
Exactly. Timber they didn't have. So to maintain their European way of life, to repair their scythes, to build their homes, to maintain their churches, they desperately needed merchant ships to sail from Norway and Iceland to deliver those goods.
But medieval merchant ships aren't charities. No merchant is going to load up a ship with heavy iron and valuable timber and then sail the deadliest, most ice-choked waters in the known world just out of the goodness of their hearts. The Greenlanders couldn't offer them milk or cheese. They needed leverage.
They needed currency.
Right. A currency valuable enough to make that incredibly dangerous voyage profitable.
And their sole leverage, the only thing that made the Greenland trade route economically viable, was walrus ivory.
This is such a wild, visceral detail to me. The survival of a European church-going outpost in the Arctic depended almost entirely on the tusks of walruses.
It was their absolute lifeline. You have to look at the luxury economy of medieval Europe. Walrus ivory was essentially the equivalent of diamonds or gold. It was a flawless, highly workable luxury material. Master craftsmen used it to carve religious reliquaries, high-status chess pieces like the famous Lewis chessman, and ornate crucifixes for the European nobility and high clergy.
Because elephant ivory was hard to get.
Right. African elephant ivory was incredibly difficult to acquire in Northern Europe at that time, so Greenland held a near monopoly on this prestige material.
Okay, let's talk about the mechanics of acquiring that ivory, because it sounds like an absolute nightmare. You can't just walk out your back door and pick up a walrus.
Not at all. The walruses didn't live near the farms in the southern fjords. To acquire this vital currency, the Greenlanders had to mount massive, incredibly dangerous hunting expeditions. Every summer, during the exact same tiny window of time when they desperately needed able-bodied men to harvest the hay for the cattle.
Oh, wow. The timing is terrible.
They had to send teams of men rowing in open wooden boats hundreds of miles north. They sailed up the coast into the treacherous, iceberg-filled hunting grounds known as the Nordsetter.
So picture this. You are a farmer. You're already stressed about whether the grass will grow enough to keep your cows alive through the dark winter. But instead of tending your fields, you have to row into the high Arctic. You have to hunt down a 2-ton, incredibly aggressive marine mammal on the sea ice.
With hand tools.
Yes. Risk your boat being crushed by calving glaciers and harvest these heavy tusks. And you do all of this just so that, hopefully, you can hand those tusks to a Norwegian merchant in exchange for a block of iron so you can fix your shovel and some wood to patch your roof.
It highlights the terrifying fragility of their existence. Their entire economy, their physical survival, and their cultural connection to Europe hung by a single, fraying thread: the European elite's demand for a luxury good.
Which really brings us to the broader cultural footprint of the Vikings and how we interact with their legacy today. You watch the big Netflix shows or play the video games, and they frequently gesture at these edge-of-the-world settlements. You see the dramatic shots of long ships pushing into the deep fog, the characters daring to sail further west than anyone else, laughing in the face of the storm.
It's very cinematic.
It is. It's portrayed as this glorious manifestation of the Viking spirit. But the reality of Greenland shows us the other side of that coin. Greenland represents the absolute limit of Viking expansion. It is the outward surge, the daring, the bravado that pop culture celebrates, taken to its absolute, terrifying, freezing extreme.
That is exactly the right lens. They pushed outward until human endurance simply could not push any further. They built a society on the very cliff edge of the habitable world. And to their immense credit, for almost 5 centuries, against all odds, they held the line. But when the global systems around them began to change, that cliff edge began to crumble beneath their feet.
Which brings us to the era that historians often refer to as the long strangulation.
It is the perfect, chilling term for it. Because what happened to the Norse Greenlanders wasn't a sudden, violent apocalypse. It was a slow, agonizing tightening of the noose over decades.
We mentioned earlier that they arrived during the medieval warm period, which made their farming possible.
Yeah.
But around the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Earth's climate shifted. The world literally turned cold.
Yeah, climatologists refer to this onset as the Little Ice Age. The average temperatures across the North Atlantic dropped. Now, you might hear a drop of a degree or two and think, well, you just wear a thicker wool sweater.
Right, no big deal.
But remember that razor-thin agricultural margin we discussed. The Little Ice Age didn't just mean colder winters. It meant the physical mechanics of their survival failed. Colder overall temperatures meant the spring thaw came later and the winter snows arrived earlier. The growing season shrank.
It's a brutal domino effect. Less time to grow means shorter grass. Shorter grass means the hay harvest fails.
Oh.
I could just imagine the terror of a Norse farmer standing in his field, feeling the bite of the first winter wind, arriving 3 weeks earlier than it did when his grandfather worked the same land.
Looking at a half-empty hay barn.
Yes. knowing exactly what that means for the cattle shivering in the stone byres, and what it will ultimately mean for his children when the milk and cheese run out by February.
The psychological toll must have been immense. But the climate didn't just attack their farms, it actively attacked their lifeline to the outside world. The dropping temperatures drastically altered the behavior of the ocean.
Oh, the sea ice.
Exactly. The polar pack ice, which normally stayed far to the north, began to grow thicker. It extended much further south down the eastern coast of Greenland, rounded Cape Farewell, and began to clog the western fjords where the settlements were located.
So the ships literally couldn't get through.
Right. The already perilous sea route between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway became nearly impassable for wooden merchant ships for longer and longer stretches of the year. The pack ice literally built a physical, grinding wall between the Greenlanders and the rest of humanity.
So they're freezing, their cattle are starving, and the merchant ships that bring the vital timber and iron are struggling to navigate through the sea ice. But there is a massive geopolitical and economic layer to this collapse, too. Because it wasn't just the physical ice keeping the ships away, was it?
No, it was a catastrophic collision of global economics and biological plague. The walrus ivory market, which, as we established, was the sole economic engine of the colony, completely collapsed.
Really? Just collapsed completely.
Yes. During this period, trade routes across the Mediterranean and North Africa began to shift and open up due to the Crusades and shifting empires. Because of these new routes, African elephant ivory started flowing into European markets in massive quantities.
And from a craftsman's perspective, elephant ivory is vastly superior.
Right.
It's much larger, you can carve bigger pieces without the dense inner core issues of a walrus tusk. And suddenly it's flooding into Venice and Genoa, working its way up to the elite markets of Paris and London.
Precisely. Elephant ivory flooded the market, and the price of walrus tusks plummeted. Think about the logistics from the perspective of a Norwegian merchant in Bergen. They look at the increasingly deadly, ice-choked voyage across the Atlantic. They look at the collapsing market price of the walrus ivory they would get in return, and they realize the math no longer works.
The risk just wasn't worth the reward anymore.
Exactly. The economic incentive to risk their ships and their lives evaporated.
And as if a local climate disaster and a devastating global market crash weren't enough, the Black Death enters the chat.
The timing is almost unbelievably tragic. In the mid-1300s, the bubonic plague swept through Europe and it hit Norway with devastating force. Now, Norway was the kingdom that politically controlled the Greenland trade. The Greenlanders had submitted to the Norwegian crown in 1261.
So Norway was essentially their lifeline's boss.
Right. And the plague wiped out a massive percentage of the Norwegian population. It decimated their skilled sailors, their wealthy merchants who funded the voyages, and the political administration that oversaw the royal monopoly on trade. Norway was physically and economically crippled.
Wow.
It simply lost the capacity, the manpower, and the administrative will to maintain an unprofitable, highly dangerous trade route to a few thousand freezing farmers sitting at the absolute edge of the earth.
It's just devastating to visualize. You were sitting there at the edge of the known world. You were looking out at the mouth of the fjord every single summer, waiting for the distinct square sails of the European cogs to appear on the horizon. Waiting for the iron you desperately need to fix your tools, the wood you need to patch your collapsing roof, the news from the Pope, just a reassurance that you are still part of the broader human family.
And year after year, nothing.
Just an endless expanse of grinding white ice, the sheer psychological terror of that slow realization that the world has forgotten you, that no one is coming to help, and you are entirely alone.
It forces us to ask the ultimate question of human survival, What do you do when the world you built no longer functions? When everything that defined your society, the pastoral farming, the luxury trade, the connection to European civilization, fails you completely. You are faced with a brutal binary choice. You either adapt or you die.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because when we say they were entirely alone, that's only true from a European perspective.
Yeah.
You weren't actually the only humans in Greenland. There was another society there dealing with the exact same onset of the Little Ice Age, the exact same plunging temperatures, and the exact same encroaching sea ice.
Yes. The ancestors of the modern Inuit, a people known to archaeologists as the Thule culture, were rapidly expanding across the Arctic during this exact period. They were migrating eastward from northern Canada, moving down the coasts of Greenland into the very areas where the Norse were struggling to survive.
And the contrast between the Norse and the Thule is one of the most haunting elements of this entire story. Because the Thule didn't just survive the Little Ice Age, They thrived in it.
Oh, absolutely. They were master, highly specialized Arctic hunters. They built incredible lightweight skin boats called umiaks and kayaks. They navigated the ice with dog sleds. They wore perfectly tailored, waterproof animal skins that functioned as highly advanced survival gear in sub-zero temperatures.
So the cold didn't bother them in the same way.
Not at all. The exact climatic conditions that were freezing the grass and starving the European farmers were essentially creating a bountiful, ice-covered hunting ground for the Thule.
This raises a profoundly important question, and I know it has been one of the most fiercely debated topics in the historical study of this collapse. Why didn't the Norse just learn from them? I mean, if you are a Norse farmer and you are literally watching your children starve while you try to keep a miserable cow alive in a blizzard, and you look across the ice and see your neighbor thriving by hunting seals and whales, why don't you put down the iron pitchfork, pick up a stone harpoon, and ask them to teach you how to live?
It's a fair question, and it brings up the famous argument, popularized by writers like Jared Diamond, the theory of cultural rigidity. Did the Norse die because they were essentially arrogant fools?
Right. Did they cling so tightly to their European cattle farming, Latin praying identity that they actively chose starvation over adopting Inuit methods?
Did they view the Thule purely through a lens of medieval Christian prejudice, seeing them as heathens or scralings, and refusing to adopt their survival techniques because doing so would mean losing their own cultural soul? It's an incredibly compelling narrative, isn't it?
I mean, I have to push back on this on behalf of anyone listening because it boggles the modern mind. Are you telling me a father would let his family die of malnutrition out of pure stubbornness?
Well, the idea that hubris and pride come before a literal fall makes for a neat moral fable. But as historians and archaeologists, we have to look past the fable and examine the hard physical evidence. And the archaeology, specifically the isotopic analysis and the findings in the middens, pushes back incredibly hard against this stubborn fool's narrative.
Okay, for the uninitiated, let's unpack the science. Explain what a midden is, how it works, and why we care so much about ancient trash.
A midden is essentially a historical rubbish heap. It is the designated area right outside a farmhouse where a family throws its food waste, broken tools, ashes, and animal bones over the course of generations. To an archaeologist, a midden isn't just trash, it's a meticulously layered time capsule.
Because it builds up over time.
Exactly, because it builds up stratigraphically, layer upon layer over the centuries. You can dig a trench down through a midden and read it chronologically, like the pages of a book. The bottom layers tell you what the founders were eating when they arrived. The middle layers show the peak of the society. And the topmost layers tell you exactly what they were consuming right before the farm was abandoned forever.
And what story do the Norse Greenland middens tell us when we dig into them?
They tell a completely devastating story of desperate, radical adaptation. When archaeologists examine the lowest, earliest layers of these trash heaps, dating back to the medieval warm period when the colony was doing relatively well, they see exactly what you'd expect from proud European pastoralists. The bones are predominantly from terrestrial livestock. It's cattle, sheep, and goats. They were eating beef and mutton, just like their cousins in Norway.
But as you move up through the dirt, as you cross into the 14th century and the Little Ice Age tightens its grip.
The layers change dramatically, both in the physical bones and in the isotopic signatures we can read in human skeletons found in the churchyards. The large cattle bones start to disappear entirely. The sheep and goat bones dwindle to a tiny fraction. And replacing them, utterly dominating the upper layers of the trash heaps, are the bones of marine mammals.
Seals.
Seals, almost exclusively. By the final years of the colony, the isotopic analysis of the Norse skeletons proves that their diet was almost entirely marine-based. They were eating up to 80% seal meat.
Wow. So they did adapt. The evidence is literally right there in the dirt and in their bones. They didn't just stubbornly sit in their farmhouses and starve next to empty cow pastures. They fought like hell to survive. They shifted their entire caloric intake from the failing land to the freezing sea.
Exactly. They transformed their diet. They hunted seals intensively in the inner fjords. They clearly observed the shifting environment and changed their behavior. But, and this is the tragic caveat of the Greenland story, whether there was a hard technological limit to their adaptation, whether they suffered from sheer demographic bad luck, or whether the combined forces of isolation, economic collapse, and cold were simply too overwhelming. They couldn't fully transform.
Right, because eating seal meat when you were starving is one thing. But they never developed the highly specialized cold weather hunting gear of the Thule. We don't find Inuit-style toggling harpoons in the Norse middens.
No, we don't. And we need to explain the mechanics of a toggling harpoon to understand why that matters. A European spear, or a simple harpoon, just pierces the flesh. If you strike a massive seal or a whale, the animal can thrash, widen the wound, and pull the weapon out, escaping under the ice.
Which is incredibly inefficient.
Right. But a thule-toggling harpoon is a masterpiece of engineering. The head is designed to detach from the shaft once it penetrates the animal. As the animal pulls the line, the harpoon head catches on the blubber and twists horizontally, anchoring itself completely inside the animal. It makes it almost impossible for the prey to escape.
And the Norse never adopted this. Why?
Right.
If they were watching the Thule use it, why not copy it?
We don't know for certain. It could be that the cultural barrier was too high to seek direct tutelage from people they viewed as heathens. It could be that the Thule, recognizing the Norse as aggressive competitors for resources, had no desire to share their proprietary survival technology. Or it could be that the Norse simply lacked the materials or the generational knowledge to craft the intricate skin boats and waterproof gear needed to hunt seals out on the dangerous, open pack ice during winter, which is what the Thule did.
So how did the Norse hunt them?
The Norse hunted seals, but they likely hunted them collectively, driving them onto the beaches of the inner fjords during specific migratory windows.
So they adapted, but they hit a hard technological and cultural ceiling. They bent as far as their medieval European society could possibly bend, but they were caught halfway between being farmers and becoming true Arctic hunters. And that middle ground simply wasn't survivable in the Little Ice Age.
They bent until they broke. And that brings us to the final chilling acts of the settlements. As we noted at the beginning, the end wasn't recorded by historians or monks or poets writing elegies. It was recorded only by the empty soil and the silence of the fjords.
Let's focus on the Western settlement first.
Yeah.
This was the smaller of the two main areas, and it was located significantly further north up the coast, making it even more intensely vulnerable to the advancing sea ice and the cooling temperatures. Sometime around the mid-1300s, the Western settlement just blinks out of existence.
Yeah, we have this incredibly eerie, almost cinematic historical account from a churchman named Ivar Barderson. He was an official sent from the bishopric and the eastern settlement to travel north to the western settlement. He was going there to deal with some administrative church matters, collect tithes, and perhaps to check on them, as communication had likely broken down.
Right.
He organizes a ship, they sail the difficult route up the coast, they navigate into the deep fjord of the western settlement, expecting to find the familiar sights of a bustling, albeit struggling, Norse community.
And what does he actually find when he drops anchor?
Nothing. Total absence. In his written account, he notes that he found the buildings, the farmhouses, and the church completely intact, but they were entirely deserted. He didn't find piles of bodies indicating a plague. He didn't find the burned ruins or arrowheads that would indicate a massacre by hostile forces. There were no signs of a desperate final stand.
Just empty.
Just empty homes, silent fjords, and the remaining livestock, horses, cattle, and sheep wandering wild, feral, and untended through the hills.
It's like stumbling onto the Mary Celeste, but an entire town. Imagine being that church official. You walk up from the beach. You open the wooden door of a farmhouse. The hearth is cold. The iron tools are left on the bench. The loom is sitting in the corner. But the people are just gone. And there is zero explanation. It is profoundly unsettling. What do modern archaeologists think happened there?
The people simply vanished into the landscape. Perhaps, after a particularly brutal winter where the hay failed completely, they systematically slaughtered what they could eat, and the survivors tried to migrate south to the eastern settlement. Perhaps they loaded onto desperate makeshift boats and were swallowed by a storm at sea. Or perhaps, weakened by malnutrition, they simply died off in small family groups, and the survivors drifted away. We will never know the exact sequence of events. But the western settlement was utterly gone.
Which leaves only the eastern settlement, the larger community further south, holding on alone in the dark. And they miraculously managed to hold on for decades longer, fighting the ice deep into the early 1400s. And the very last glimpse we get of them in the historical record is so shockingly, painfully mundane.
It really is. The final documented moment in the 500-year history of the Norse Greenlanders occurs in September of the year 1408. A merchant ship from Iceland, blown wildly off course by a storm, manages to navigate the ice and arrives in the eastern settlement. And the crew of this ship witnesses, and later legally records back in Iceland, a wedding.
A wedding at the Valsey Church, the exact ruined stone church we asked you to picture standing in at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Yes. A man named Thorstein Olafsson married a woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir. It was a completely normal, standard medieval European Christian wedding. The bans were formally read over 3 consecutive Sundays to ensure there were no objections. A priest presided over the Latin Mass. There was a feast afterward.
Incredible.
The visiting Icelandic sailors were asked to serve as formal witnesses, and they recorded the event with all the rigid legal formality required by the medieval church to ensure the marriage was valid back in Europe.
There's something so profoundly heartbreaking about the juxtaposition of that scene. Think about the reality of 1408.
Yeah.
You have this society teetering on the absolute brink of total extinction. The climate is physically freezing them out of their homes. The trade ships have essentially abandoned them. Their diet has devolved from beef and cheese to eating nothing but seal meat to survive.
Yeah.
They know full well that their sister settlement to the north is a literal ghost town. And
yet they carry on.
they are still standing inside a beautifully constructed stone church. They are wearing their finest, carefully preserved European woolen clothes. They are exchanging vows in Latin. They are trying desperately to maintain the rhythms, the dignity, and the rituals of human life. They are trying to preserve the illusion of their society right up to the final moment.
It speaks to a profound, tragic resilience. They were not panicking savages running into the hills. They were a community trying to live. But after those Icelandic sailors boarded their ship, navigated back out through the ice, and sailed away, the historical record goes totally, completely blank.
The ultimate fade out.
The Great Silence. We don't know exactly what happened in the years or decades after that wedding in 1408. Did a final, impossibly brutal winter freeze the remaining inhabitants in their beds? Did the youngest, strongest people slowly drift away on small boats, trying to find a legal passage on English fishing vessels, leaving only the elderly behind to die off one farm at a time? Did they finally try to assimilate with the Thule, only to lose their linguistic and cultural identity completely?
The archaeological digs show no mass graves. The ground just shows a society shrinking, pulling inward, consolidating into fewer and fewer farms, struggling against the cold and then simply stopping. The last fires in the hearths went out. The roofs eventually rotted and caved in, and they were gone.
So, as we zoom out from the ruins of Falsey, what does this all mean? When we look at the silent disappearance, how does it reshape our understanding of the Viking legacy that we've spent this entire series exploring?
That is the essential question to end on, because we've spent this entire deep dive series talking about the massive, enduring, world-changing footprint of the Vikings. And if you look at the overarching theme of our Nordic Saga, whether we were talking about the Danelaw or the Normans or the Rus, the defining characteristic of Viking success was always absorption.
Yes. Everywhere else they went, the Vikings survived the end of the Viking Age by blending in. They didn't just conquer territories, they merged with the people they conquered.
Exactly. And the mechanism behind that is key. In England, as we discussed in episode 26, they didn't just raid monasteries forever. They settled the Danelaw, intermarried, and fundamentally altered the English language and bloodline. In France, in episode 11, we saw how they adopted the French language and feudalism to become the Normans, who then went on to reshape the entire history of Europe.
The Rus in the East, too.
Right. In episode 24, they didn't just extract tribute. They integrated with the Slavic populations to become the Rus, literally laying the genetic and cultural foundations for modern Eastern European nations. In Ireland, they founded the major trading cities like Dublin and folded themselves seamlessly into local Celtic politics. They survived everywhere else by becoming the ancestors of living, breathing modern nations. They adapted by becoming someone else.
But Greenland is the tragic counterstory. It is the dark shadow side of the Viking expansion.
Because they did not assimilate.
They didn't assimilate. They didn't blend their culture with the Thule people to create a new, hybrid, resilient Arctic culture. They didn't leave a linguistic legacy of Norse loanwords in the regional Inuit dialects. They didn't become the ancestors of a living nation. They are the one major branch of the mighty, sprawling Viking tree that simply withered, froze, and died. They left no descendants. They left only the silence of the ruins.
It really makes you reflect deeply on the vulnerability of human societies. Because as modern people, we have this profound, inbuilt psychological bias to assume that progress is a straight line. We assume that survival is guaranteed as long as you are brave enough or tough enough or work hard enough. And the Greenland Norse were incredibly brave. They were arguably some of the toughest, most physically tenacious humans to ever walk the earth.
Oh, without question.
They fought the crushing ice for 5 centuries. They did everything they possibly could, completely overhauling their diets, holding their isolated communities together, keeping their faith in the dark. And yet,
it wasn't enough. Greenland stands as a stark, unforgiving reminder that entire societies, entire complex cultures can valiantly fight the dying of the light, do everything within their power to survive, and still fade into nothingness. Bravery and stubbornness do not guarantee survival when the world shifts beneath you.
So as we prepare to close this file, and indeed close this entire series, what is the final thought we should take away from the empty, roofless church at Ivalsi?
I think the disappearance of the Norse Greenlanders serves as the ultimate parable of environmental change and societal survival. We often study history to find mirrors for our own times, and there is no clearer, more urgent mirror than this. What happens to a complex, interconnected society when it can no longer adapt to a rapidly changing climate? What happens when the underlying environmental and global economic systems that support a specific way of life simply collapse? The Norse Greenlanders were trapped in a vice by a shifting climate on one side and an unraveling global trade network on the other. They could not fully adapt their core identity to match their terrifying new reality. It is a haunting, profound warning about the limits of human resilience when the Earth itself turns against you.
That is a chilling and incredibly necessary thought to hold on to.
It is the truth of the ruins.
And with that, we have reached the end, not just of the Greenland story, but the true end of this entire saga. For everyone listening, we want to take a moment to just say a very genuine, heartfelt thank you. You've traveled with us on this deep dive, from the terrifying sight of the first dragon ships appearing through the mist off the coast of Lindisfarne, through the sprawling trade routes of the East, through the halls of kings and the poetry of the skalds, all the way to this final, silent ruin under the vast Arctic sky.
It's been an incredible journey.
It really has. We've explored the myths, the bloody battles, the ingenious engineering, and the profound cultural shifts. We've tried to show you who the Vikings truly were, not the one-dimensional cartoonish brutes of pop culture, but a people who were incredibly bold, frequently cruel, fiercely brilliant, endlessly restless, and so vividly, complexly human.
They pushed the absolute boundaries of the known world, and in doing so, they left an indelible mark on the trajectory of human history. Even here, in their ultimate failure at the frozen edge of the world, their sheer audacity commands our awe.
We hope that as you go forward in your own life, you carry a little bit of that daring Viking courage with you. The courage to look out at the horizon, to question what lies beyond it, and sail bravely beyond the edge of what you know. This has been our deep dive into the Nordic Saga. Skál. Farewell, and may the winds be kind to you always.